Well, to start with, Victor, thank you for those very generous words. I'm acutely conscious that although I have been the chair of this commission for the last several months, I have also been the least qualified person on the commission. It's been a privilege to work with such an impressive and committed group of people who are truly world-leading experts in a range of relevant disciplines, from public health, obviously, medical R&D, medical anthropology, health systems design, reinsurance, community leadership. So we have had a very impressive group of people. We have also benefited from enormous support from Victor and the National Academy. Patrick, Cici, Ayano, and the rest of the team have really, Victor talked about burning the midnight oil. There has been a lot of midnight oil burned. We have had to absorb an enormous amount of input, synthesize it, pull it together into recommendations, manage what is always quite a difficult task of getting 17 strong-minded people in different parts of the world to agree on things in a very short time frame. And throughout this, we have benefited from the guidance and support of our sponsors, particularly the Rockefeller Foundation and the IOG. What I now want to do is give you a quick sense of what we're going to do in terms of introducing the report. To start with, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the recommendations so that you have a sense of the totality and how they fit together. Because the way we've thought about this is not just as a laundry list, not as a laundry list of recommendations, but as recommendations that together comprise a framework to counter the threat of infectious diseases. I'm then going to hand over to three of my fellow commissioners to talk in more detail and richness about the detail and thinking behind the recommendations. First of all, immediately to my right, Irene Akua Agyepong of the Greater Accra Regional Health Directorate of the Ghana Health Service. Irene will talk about the way we thought about our recommendations for public health capabilities and infrastructure at a national level, which we see as the first line of defense against infectious disease outbreaks. Second, Gabriel Leung, Dean of the Li Ka-shing Faculty of Medicine, University of Hong Kong, will talk about our thinking behind our recommendations for strengthening global and regional systems for preparedness and response. And then Maria Freire, furthest to the right, President, Foundation for the National Institutes of Health in the United States, will explain the logic of our recommendations in the R&D arena. And then I will then return to talk about the financing of these recommendations, how it works, and also to provide a few concluding remarks. We'll then hand over to our moderator, Peggy Hamburg, former commissioner of the FDA, who will lead the discussion of the report. So as I said, I'm going to quickly summarize the recommendations so you get a sense of how they fit together. I'm not going to go into the detail of each of the 26, so don't worry if I appear to be skipping over some of the points or if you're not entirely clear what they mean. There'll be plenty of opportunity either in the fuller description of the individual commissioners or in the discussion for you to understand them better. But the idea is we want to give you a sense of what the big picture, what the overall framework looks like. The recommendations fall into four buckets. First of all, and I'm going to refer to the relevant chapters of the report. First of all, in Chapter 2, the case for investing in pandemic preparedness, we make three overarching recommendations. First, that the G7, G20, and the UN should implement the framework set out in this report and embodied in the recommendations. Second, that we need to mobilize the funds required to make this happen, about $4.5 billion a year. And third, that independent assessments of progress should be implemented. The logic of this is pretty straightforward. We do need to take action. As Larry, I think, put it very compellingly, the ratio of seriousness to policy attention is extreme in this arena. We must address the failings revealed by the Ebola outbreak. We must strengthen our defenses. We must invest more. And we need to track our progress and hold ourselves accountable for making it happen. The second set of recommendations comes from Chapter 3, Strengthening Public Health as the Foundation of the Health System and First Line of Defense. Here we put forward 10 recommendations. These are all about reinforcing public health capabilities and infrastructure on the ground. We want a clear definition and benchmarks for national core capabilities in public health, so there is total clarity on what a good public health system is and does. We need regular, independent and transparent assessment mechanism against these benchmarks so that governments know where they stand and civil society can hold them accountable. We need every country to participate, since in the fight against infectious diseases, we all depend on each other's defenses. To reinforce the incentive to participate in these assessments, World Bank and other donors should make their support conditional on participation. We want the IMF to include pandemic preparedness in its assessments of economic risk and policy. This will focus financial market attention on such risks, and that in turn will increase the attention that finance ministers pay to such risks. The assessment will undoubtedly reveal gaps in countries' capabilities, so we need the governments to develop plans to rectify those gaps, and we need the WHO to provide technical assistance on how they can do so. Where possible, we think national governments should finance their own public health infrastructure through domestic resources, since this is the best way to ensure ownership and sustainability. However, we recognize that this won't be possible in the poorest countries, so we're looking to the World Bank to convene other multilateral and bilateral donors to develop international resourcing support for these countries. And we also recognize the need for specific strategies for failed and fragile states and war zones. Irene will talk further about these recommendations. The third set of recommendations is from Chapter 4, Strengthening the Global and Regional System for Outbreak, Preparedness, Alert and Response. Here again we have 10 recommendations. The first 3 are directed at the WHO's capability in playing the leading role in coordinating preparedness and response. We want to see the creation of a Centre for Health Emergency Preparedness and Response, overseen by an independent technical governing board. We think the centre needs to be properly funded through an increase in member state core contributions, and we also support the establishment of the WHO's contingency fund. Yet the WHO does not operate in isolation, and the Ebola crisis revealed many weaknesses in coordination mechanisms across the international system. So the next 3 recommendations are about improving coordination and escalation with the rest of the UN system, improving coordination at a regional level, and improving coordination and cooperation with non-state actors, including the private sector, NGOs, and communities. One lesson we have repeatedly learned is that delays in raising infectious disease alerts have huge costs in terms of both lives and money, given the exponential nature of the threat. Yet countries are often reluctant to raise alerts since they fear the consequences. One way to address this is to somewhat normalize the alert processes by having a more regularly published watch list of potential international health emergencies. Another way is to tighten up the protocols and sanctions around alerts and around the way other countries respond to these alerts. And finally, the World Bank and IMF have important roles to play in mobilizing funds to support crisis response. And we support the World Bank's Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility proposal. Gabriel will talk further about these recommendations. The final set of recommendations is from Chapter 5 of the report, Accelerating Research and Development to Counter the Threat of Infectious Disease. Here we have 3 recommendations: the creation of an independent panel, the PPDC, to prioritize and coordinate R&D spend in this arena, mobilization of an additional $1 billion a year in R&D spend, and an initiative to tackle the impediments to rapid development and approval of new products. In an environment where time is critical, duplication and complexity of our current processes is a big problem. This is not about compromising scientific standards, but about more streamlining and harmonization. And Maria will talk further about the recommendations here. So what do these 26 recommendations add up to? Taken together, they will establish much stronger national public health capabilities, infrastructure and processes built to a common standard and regularly assessed through an objective, transparent process which is fully consistent with international legal obligations under the international health regulations. Larry's point about what gets measured and made transparent is incredibly important here. Second, more effective global and regional capabilities led by a re-energized WHO with a dedicated center for health emergency preparedness and response and coordinated more effectively with the rest of the UN system and supported by the World Bank and IMF. And finally, an accelerated program of R&D deploying $1 billion a year and coordinated through a dedicated committee. So, to give you I realize I've sort of cantered through that at great pace. To give you a bit more detail on each of those three key areas, I'll now ask my three fellow commissioners to talk first about the national public health capabilities and infrastructure, second about the global and regional coordination mechanisms, and third about the R&D. So starting with Irene on national public health.
Thank you. So I will elaborate still briefly, but a bit more detail, on strengthening public health as the foundation of the health system and the first line of defense. And the top priority and the first line of defense against potential pandemics is to build stronger public health infrastructure and capabilities. However, far too many countries have failed to build these necessary capabilities, and it's estimated that about 67% of WHO member states fail to meet the requirements of the international health regulations. Building and sustaining strong health systems is achievable with leadership and commitment at national, provincial, and local levels, even in relatively poor countries. And a good example is Uganda. Despite remaining resource constrained, Uganda has moved from 38 days between the first reported known case of Ebola and preliminary investigations, which led to an outbreak. That was the biggest outbreak before the West African outbreak of 426 cases. Uganda has moved down to 1 to 2 days and less than 30 cases in their last two outbreaks. And yet they are a resource constrained country, so it is possible. And to achieve this, firstly, clarity is needed on the benchmark attributes of a highly functioning public health system and transparency about actual achievements against these benchmarks. So, WHO, in collaboration with member states, should establish clear definition and benchmarks for national core public health system capabilities and functions. And these should be based on and implemented through the international health regulations and built upon the experiences of other efforts, such as the Global Health Security Agenda and the OIE Terrestrial Animal Health Code. To evaluate country performance of reaching these benchmarks and publish the results, WHO should devise an independent, transparent, and objective assessment. Publications of such assessments, so that they are freely available to everybody, will enable civil society to hold governments accountable and facilitate prioritization and monitoring of progress. Part of the problem with the IHR has been that everybody reports what they've been doing, and whatever they say is what we take. Leadership is critical. We've already mentioned how Uganda has demonstrated leadership despite being a low-income country. And governments, both low, middle, high income, needs to recognize that protecting against the threat of infectious diseases is a fundamental part of their basic duty to protect their citizens. Thus, governments should create, sorry, the slides are just a summary. So, okay. Thus, governments should create plans to achieve and maintain benchmark core capacities. They should develop domestic resourcing plans to finance improvement and maintenance of these core capacities. And these problems cut across. It's not just low-income countries, it's everybody. The upper and upper middle-income countries should ensure sufficient financing for public health systems incorporated into their national budgets. Lower middle and low income countries also need to adequately invest in these domestic core capacities. There will be a need for external assistance to rectify deficiencies and build capacities, but the primary responsibility is that of the countries. And even lower income governments should seek to devise pathways towards full domestic resourcing. And then all countries need to commit to participate in external assessment processes. The next slide. So to help strengthen these national core capacities, global and regional support should be galvanized. For example, development partners should support the financing and implementation of country plans where needed. The World Bank and other multilateral donors should declare that funding related to health system strengthening will be conditional on signing up for the assessment mechanisms to reinforce country incentives to participate in these assessment mechanisms. The International Monetary Fund should include pandemic preparedness in their country economic and policy assessments to underscore the importance of pandemic preparedness as a way of protecting economic growth and stability. And then for fragile states, failed states, and war zones, the UN Secretary General should take the lead, working with the WHO and other parts of the UN system to sustain at least minimal public health capacities within the context of broader UN strategy. Finally, just before I sit down, just to reinforce the issues around strengthening public health as the foundation of the health system and first line of defense, I want to draw upon a proverb of the Akan people, which says that if an elder watches children cook and eat a poisonous snake and does nothing and says nothing to stop it, when the list of those responsible for the disaster is made, their name will be on that list. And I want to end because we have been saying that countries are responsible. Yes, countries are responsible. But despite countries being responsible at their front line, it is also a global responsibility. We have to watch out for each other. We are all accountable and need to encourage each other to take the appropriate action and support each other. If we don't do that, and the first spark starts in any country, however obscure and remote, and it becomes an uncontrollable forest fire, as happened with Ebola, all our names will be on the person's responsible list for allowing children to cook and eat a poisonous snake. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene, for so passionately reinforcing that the first line of defense at the country level is the foundation of the global health risk framework we're presenting to you today. Strengthening international coordination and capabilities is the next most vital component. Pandemics know no borders, and so international cooperation is essential. This is a very tired cliche, although it is truer now more than ever. The global chain of health protection is only as robust as its weakest link. Health is the most vital dimension of global security. Therefore, the protection of health in infectious disease crises is a global public good requiring collective action. Now, Ebola revealed significant shortcomings in the functioning and performance of the international public health system's execution, coordination, and leadership at multiple levels. an empowered and re-energized WHO must play the leading role in identifying, preventing, and responding to potential epidemics and pandemics, but the WHO must make significant changes to play this role more effectively. It needs more capability and more resources, and it must demonstrate greater technical and moral leadership, both in the field and in the corridors of power. To do so, first, the WHO should create a Center for Health Emergency Preparedness and Response, with a technical governing board, or TGB in short, to lead the global outbreak preparedness and response. The center should be nimble, scientific, apolitical, and well-resourced. We emphasize that it should be a center, not a program, reflecting its status as a permanent and critical component of the WHO's role in fighting infectious disease crises. Examples of the center's capabilities would include, but not limited to, managing surveillance for outbreaks and events, risk assessment, planning and execution of response, assessment of international health regulation functions and compliance, coordination with partners, risk communication, quality assurance, monitoring, and so on. The center should be funded through an appropriate increase in the member states' core contributions for sustainable funding. The center should be overseen by a technical governing board, and the TGB should be chaired by the Director General, but otherwise, its composition should comprise members who are independent of and drawn from outside of the WHO on the basis of technical merit. Second, Ebola revealed weaknesses in the WHO's coordination with other players. WHO needs to establish clear pathways for multi-sectoral coordination with other UN agencies, regional networks, and non-state actors, including civil society organizations and the private sector, to identify roles and responsibilities and effective ways of working together to leverage strengths. The composition of the TGB, which, as we've proposed, would include representation from other parts of the UN system, should facilitate the coordination between the WHO and the UN, but other mechanisms for coordination and escalation in health crises are also needed. Importantly, coordination and consolidation of the relevant functions within WHO, in particular across different geographic units, in country, at the regional offices, and at HQ in Geneva, need equal and urgent attention. Third, at the moment, there is no formalized intermediate level of public alert below a public health event of international concern, or PHEIC. It's currently an all or none phenomenon. Mechanisms need to be built to raise awareness of the underlying pattern of potential threats and normalize the process of raising alerts, which are delayed or suppressed by officials fearful of the economic and political consequences. To help address these issues, we suggest that a daily high-priority watch list of outbreaks with pandemic potential should be generated and communicated to member states via the national focal points, as specified in the IHR, with a weekly summary posted on the WHO website for public consumption, so that this is no longer seen as something rare, but as part and parcel of normal routine surveillance. Fourth, there is a need to create protocols to hold national governments accountable for performance under the IHR. Irene just outlined to you what we suggest are important items to pay attention to in strengthening capabilities at the national and subnational level. The global community should establish tougher norms and be prepared to, as Larry Summers had just put it, quite frankly, name and shame where necessary. After all, as I've just said, this whole global health protection chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And there are plenty of externalities that need to be focused on this particular neglected dimension of global security. Now, how would we do this? This would include protocols for avoiding suppression or delays in data and alerts, and for avoiding excessive trade or travel restrictions. Fifth, and finally, we need to mobilize financial resources swiftly to support the overall response strategy to allow this to work at the global level. As I mentioned earlier, the new center, should be funded through redeploying existing resources plus an appropriate increase in member states' core contributions. Second, a $100 million contingency fund should be created and funded to support rapid deployment of emergency response capabilities. This could be funded through one-off contributions or commitments proportional to the assessed contributions from member states. At the third level, as a complement to the WHO Contingency Fund, the Commission welcomes the creation of the World Bank's Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility, or PEF, as a rapidly deployable source of funds to support pandemic response. And at the fourth level, to ease fiscal pressure on governments that raise infectious disease outbreak alerts as they should, and to reduce the incentive to avoid doing so, the IMF should make very clear that it is in a position to provide budgetary assistance when needed. Now I will pass on to Maria to talk about the R&D aspects of our report.
Good morning. In order to get a job done, we need the right tools. Without our understanding of the nature of the disease, without the ability to diagnose, without the vaccines to protect, and without the drugs to help the people who are affected, we can have all the infrastructure in the world and we will not be able to get the job done. This is the role of the science. This is the role of the scientist. As a society and as a community, we have the responsibility of ensuring that the first responders are protected, that the people who are affected have the ability to get well, and for us to understand what is happening during the emergency so that we learn and we don't repeat the mistakes that we have already done. So this is a process, it's a dynamic process that has several aspects to it. When looking at R&D, we have to have investment in three key areas. The first, do I have this right? Am I on the right slide? Yes, good. The first is to develop and strengthen core functions. Without knowing the ability and the capabilities of the R&D stakeholders and the infrastructure in country for the diagnosis, we will have serious problems. We need to know the etiology of disease. We need to be able to screen. The second is we need to continue and we need to expand and accelerate what we're currently doing in R&D. And there are multiple groups around the world that are financing R&D in infectious diseases. However, that needs to be accelerated and supported even more. And finally, we need innovation. We need to innovate the way we develop medicines. We need to innovate the way we regulate how these medicines can come to the patient. We need to have new ways of doing clinical trials. This has to be a concerted effort, and we are doing parts of it, but not together. What the Commission is proposing in order to accelerate the R&D in a coordinated manner, we create what we're calling a Pandemic Product Development Committee, the PPDC, which, by the way, I will transpose the letters as I go along, so bear with me. The chair of this committee will be appointed by the WHO DG, and he will sit in this technical governing board that Gabriel just mentioned. However, we envision this committee to be about 15 independent members, the best minds around the world that can contribute to the solution of the problem in times when there is no emergency and in times where there is an emergency. Therefore, the composition has to include people that are expert in infectious diseases, people that are expert in manufacturing, people that are expert in regulatory and innovative ways of doing clinical trials, the role of the industry, the expert in manufacturing medical products, etc. We envision that the WHO will serve as a secretariat, and the Commission was very clear that this is a nimble and lean secretariat. The majority of the money and the funding that comes towards this group should be devoted to financing a portfolio approach of tools. And by tools, I mean diagnostics, I mean drugs, and I mean vaccines, along with the supporting infrastructure like personal protective equipment. This group, therefore, will help pinpoint the existing capabilities, will help identify the gaps, will help understand what the priorities are, and figure out mechanisms and ways and identify the right players in the world that can come together to solve that particular issue. This doesn't come cheaply. We expect that it will take about $1 billion a year to maintain this portfolio of research. This is an active and aggressive way of trying to tackle this global problem. It will be sourced from, we expect it could be sourced from different contributions. Direct contributions from governments, people who already have R&D budgets that can help in their own way by participating either directly or indirectly as part of this community effort, existing philanthropic and university R&D budgets that also could be part of the contribution, the private sector, and new sources of private financing outside the traditional R&D financing sectors. Let's see. Finally, one of the continuous themes, not only through Ebola, but through our experience now in several other pandemics, and certainly as part of the discussion in this, in our commission, was the important role of the local communities. Without the anthropological understanding and the research that needs to be done by the people in the field, we will have developed the best technology, but it may not be adopted and it may not be accepted. So ensuring that we have the social fiber and the understanding to allow the products and the projects to be undertaken is critically important. We have also highlighted the importance of having consistent, the highest scientific and ethical standards when conducting research, particularly in clinical trials in the field. We need data that is strong and data that is interpretable, with the ability to have valid conclusions, both positive and negative, made very clear, so that as a society we learn and we can better the next time we undertake the pandemic attack. We need open, bilateral, multilateral information exchanges with local communities from the outset, and we need to streamline protocols and approaches to expedite the approval, manufacturing, and distribution of the products. We need, for example, pre-approved clinical trial design, mechanisms for intellectual property management, data sharing, product liability, vaccine manufacturing, stockpiling, and distribution capabilities. The R&D group has 3 recommendations. It looks simple. This is one of the most complex and ambitious undertakings, and we by no means are naive in thinking or understanding that this will be a simple enterprise. We do think that it is the way to move forward, and we do think that it will make a huge amount of difference. So we're very optimistic. Again, this is an issue of global importance and global security. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irene, Gabriel, and Maria. I'm going to talk very briefly about the financing side of things, but before I do so, one thing that struck me looking at the slides that it isn't coming through strongly enough from the slides, but is very strong in the report, is the importance of engagement with communities. An absolutely critical part of any successful public health system is active engagement with communities. Communities can provide a fantastic radar screen for detecting outbreaks. They are critical to outbreak response, and when you don't have the right engagement with communities, can also be critical in impeding or preventing that response to be as effective as it should be. And also in the research side of things, if you are actively conducting research during an outbreak in the way that one has to, as Maria described, you need to have the community with you. And that, I was just reflecting, thinking, our slides don't quite capture how strongly that actually is in the body of the report itself. So money. No doubt you're all saying this is all well and good, but you know, who's going to pay for it? So that's what I'm going to address. Or not. Okay, the first thing you have to do is recognize that we do have to step up our investment. There is no sort of free lunch in the sense of we can do a better job and it won't cost more money. But the scale of the risk is huge. I thought our $60 billion number a year was quite a big number until Larry came along and decided that it was a much bigger number. And the reality is we have neglected this dimension of human security. Again, as Larry put it, the ratio of seriousness to attention has been very extreme. So we need to commit resources. We are talking about committing an additional $4.5 billion per year. We could have argued for more, but that sum would make a huge difference in making the world safer. It comprises 3 components. The biggest by far is the cost of upgrading public health systems to the national health system, which we've put at the top end of a range of 1.9 to 3.4, so we're towards the 3.4 figure. A second component is about $130 to $155 million a year in reinforcing the WHO and funding the contingency finance schemes both in the WHO and in the World Bank. And finally, there is the $1 billion of incremental R&D spend that Maria was talking about. In thinking about where this comes from, the important point is that it doesn't just come from one source. There's no one entity that's going to be writing a check for $4.5 billion here. We envisage the biggest component, the towards $3.4 billion for upgrading of public health, to be the starting point for financing that will be domestic fiscal resources wherever possible, with international support focused on the poorest countries and on fragile and failed states. And the reason for reliance on domestic fiscal support is that is the way to ensure long-term ownership and sustainability. This is not about building a dam or a bridge or a road. This is expenditure that is going to have to be sustained year in, year out. The incremental support for the WHO, both for the center that we described, for health emergency preparedness and response, and for the contingency fund, should ideally be on the basis of assessed contributions, not on voluntary contributions, since this is a core function of the WHO and therefore needs committed funding. The World Bank's Pandemic Emergency Facility could be financed through innovative insurance or capital market solutions, if these can be demonstrated to be cost-effective and flexible, or alternatively from contingent binding commitments from donor governments, or indeed a combination of the two. And these mechanisms are discussed in some length in the report. The incremental $1 billion for R&D is a challenging ask, we recognize, but as Maria described, we have identified a variety of potential sources, both public and private, including potential innovative new sources of finance. Finding $4.5 billion per year will not be easy, but it is not out of reach, and the alternative is frankly much more expensive. Waiting for infectious disease crises to occur and then reacting to them costs much more in lives, and these could number in hundreds of thousands or millions, and cost much more in money than being well prepared in the first place. And indeed, the Ebola outbreak is a very good example of how much more it costs to react to a crisis than it does to prepare well and prevent them getting out of hand in the first place. So the business case is compelling, and through political will, determination, we believe that $4.5 billion is a number that can be sourced from a variety of different components. Right. So to conclude, if you take away one big message from the report, it's that infectious disease crises, potential pandemics, are not just a health issue. They are a fundamental threat to human security, both in terms of human security and in terms of lives and in terms of economic well-being. And secondly, we have neglected this threat. It does not receive the attention or resources of other risks to humankind, and Ebola and other outbreaks have revealed very significant shortcomings in almost every aspect of our defenses. As somebody who comes from the world of business, this is a pretty compelling investment case. $4.5 billion per year would make a very significant difference to the risk to human lives and to human livelihoods. And the case for investing in preparedness relative to reacting and spending the money afterwards is also extremely strong. The recommendations are designed to work together to constitute a coherent framework for countering the threat of infectious disease crises. They fall, as you've heard, into three broad buckets: reinforcing the first line of defense, public health capabilities and infrastructure to national level. Second, strengthening capabilities and coordination at a regional and global level. And third, accelerating R&D. So we have more powerful tools from the world of science to combat this threat. The Commission believes we must act with urgency, and we must hold ourselves accountable by monitoring implementation. We all have, as Irene put very, very powerfully. We all have a shared interest in making the world safer, and we are all accountable. So thank you very much for listening this morning, and I'd now like to hand over to Peggy to moderate the discussion. Thank you.